Okay. Good evening, everybody. I've been meaning to give this shiur for quite some time. You may have noticed, those of you who daven in the main shul on Yantiv, that for quite some time now we've had the minhag of when we read the Megillah from a klaf on Yantiv, whether it's Rus, Shiur Hashirim, or Koheles. We just did Shiur Hashirim over Pesach. We make two brachas. We make Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al mikra Megillah, same bracha that we make on Megillah Esther, and we make a bracha of Shehechiyanu. And the question is, where does this come from? And what should be irk someone who's just looking at this practice is this a mandated bracha? Where does this come from? Where does this idea to read the Megillah come from? There are some communities who don't read the Megillah, which means that it's not a halacha, it's not an obligation, and it seems to be only a minhag. How can you say Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu on something that's merely a minhag? So we're going to work from the particular to the general, and I'm going to, how many of you are bothered by this idea of making a bracha and reading a Megillah? It doesn't, you couldn't care less. Okay. Okay. All right. So maybe bothered is not the word. Maybe puzzled. Scratched your head. Okay. Why are they doing this? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Could it be possibly a bracha levatala? Okay. Let me ask you another question, which I'm foreshadowing for the future. Tomorrow night is going to be Rosh Chodesh. One of the features of Rosh Chodesh davening is the recital of Hallel. Do we say full Hallel or half Hallel? Half Hallel. Why do we only recite half Hallel? Rosh Chodesh is not mentioned by the Gemara, as it's only mentioned that there was an Amora who recited half Hallel. And it seems that it's only a minhag, that in some places they had a minhag to recite Hallel, and some places they had a minhag not to recite Hallel. And it's on that basis that the Rambam paskins that when you recite Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, you do not make a bracha, because you don't make a bracha on a minhag. Which we're gonna see all of this. I don't know if we'll get to see all of it tonight, or maybe Baruch Rafei Cholim, Robert. It's great to have you back. Whether or not we'll be able to see that tonight or not, we'll see. But the question is, we make a bracha on Hallel, do we not? On Rosh Chodesh, is that not a bracha levatala? Okay, so we're going to go from the particular and see the halacha about whether or not it's mandated to say a bracha on reading Shiur Hashirim in Rus and Koheles, and then and Eicha, by the way, also, and then we're going to expand from that to the general question of when do we make a bracha on a minhag, or do we ever make a bracha on a minhag? So the earliest source for laning Megillahs on Chol HaMoed or on Yantif in general is from Maseches Sofrim. The Chida has demonstrated that Maseches Sofrim, it's one of the what's called Masechtos Ketanos, it's one of the minor tractates. It's a minor tractate because it was not written together with the rest of Shas. It was compiled during the times of the Gaonim, based on halachas that had been established up until that time. So it doesn't have the same potency as a Gemara does or a Mishnah. It's post-Talmudic. And it says in Maseches Sofrim as follows. Source number one, we're going to see two little snippets. Virus b'shir hashirim b'koheles be'echa v'megillas Esther, tzarich levarech. That before you read any one of those 5 Megillas, you have to make a bracha. V'lomar al mikra Megillah. Ve'af al pi shekesuva ba kesuvin. even though it's part of a larger scroll of Cha. What I mean by Cha? Well, it's not Tanakh, it's not Nach, it's just Ch. It's just, well, in other words, you have a scroll just of Ksuvim, right? Even though it's written in a scroll just of Ksuvim, and it's not its own cloth, you would still make a bracha. V'hakori b'ksuvim tzarech loimar, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav etzivanu likro b'kisvei hakodesh. And when you're laning from a scroll of Ksuvim, not just from the Megillah itself as a standalone, you make a separate bracha. Let me actually just bring the Makoros on my screen for those who are watching this shiur not live. Just give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, so that's the first halacha. That's from Perek Yudalid in Masechet Sofrim, halacha Aleph. The same Perek in Masechet Sofrim later on says, B'shir Hashirim, Korin Oso B'leile Shnei Yomim Tovim Shel Goliyos Achronim, Chetzio B'layla Echad, V'chetzio B'layla Hasheni. It tells us a minhag as far as reading Shir Hashirim that we don't do today. So it says that you read it on the 2 days of the last day of Pesach, right? That when you're living in Galus, clearly this is not being written in the times of the Mishnah. It's being written in Bavel, post-Talmudic. You read half of Shir Hashirim the first night, and the second half of Shir Hashirim the second night, and Berus b'motzoi Yom Tov Harishon Shel Atzeres Ad Chetzio, Umashlim b'motzoi Yom Tov Ha'acharon. And again, it's strange. Rus, you also divide in half. You read it after the first day, that night going into the second day Shavuos, and then you read it Motzai Shavuos. Again, it's very, very strange. And some say that for these Megillas, you start reading it on Motzai Shabbos before the Chag. B'nagu kein ha'am, or for the last days of the Chag. B'nagu kein ha'am shein halacha nikvas ad sheyeh minhag. And this is the minhag of the people, because you can't have something established as halacha until it is first accepted into practice by the people. V'sesha amru minhag mevatel halacha minhag vasikin aval minhag she'en lo raya min haTorah ena ela ketova b'shikol hadas. So you have to know that there are the last part of Masechah Sofrim. There are minhagim and there are minhagim. There are some minhagim that are very strong and have a very rich and solid history, and then there are other minhagim that we don't follow because they don't have a strong basis. That's all we have as far as that's the oldest text we have as far as the minhag of laning these Megillas over the Yom Tov. If we take a look at the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber says nothing about laning Megillas over the Shalosh Regalim. And someone told me, I hope someone can verify this for me, that in Sephardi shuls, they do not lane the Megillas. They do not lane Shir Hashirim, they do not lane Rus, they do not lane Koheles in shul. Could be that they read them privately, but this is not a minhag to be read in the shul. But the Ramah comes along in Siman Taf Tzadi, and he says, "V'nohagid lomar Shir Hashirim b'Shabbat shel Chol HaMoed." Our minhag is to recite Shir Hashirim on the Shabbos of Chol HaMoed Pesach. V'im Shabbos b'Yom Tov ha'achron omrim oto ba'oto Shabbat. And if Shabbos falls out, there is no Shabbos during Chol HaMoed, it falls out on the last day of Pesach, that's when you recite Shir Hashirim. V'chein hadin b'Sukkot im Kohelet. The same thing applies to Sukkos with Koheles. V'noagin lomar Rus b'Shavuos, and we say Rus on Shavuos. Now, here comes the interesting part. V'ha'am nahagu, shelo levarech aleihim al mirka Megillah, v'lo al mikra ktuvim. And the is noiheg, and it's a very strange language. Normally, I would say the yesh nohag. But he writes here a very strange language of v'ha'am nahagu, that this has become the minhag of the Welt, not to make a bracha on these Megillot, neither al mikra Megillah nor al mikra ketuvim, since in the event that it's written as part of a larger scroll. Now the Levush is a Talmud of the Ramah. And here is one of those very rare instances where he's being cholek with his Rebbe, the Ramah. Now, there's a reason for this, because in the Darkei Moshe, which we don't have in front of us, the Darkei Moshe was written by the Ramah also. Where will you find the Darkei Moshe? You'll find it as a commentary to the Tur, written by the Ramah. He writes not the way that he writes here in Shulchan Aruch. In the Darkei Moshe, the Ramah says that the minhag is to make a bracha. He later changed his mind when he wrote the Shulchan Aruch, and he said, paskind not to make a bracha. Along the Levush, he says, you have the underlying portion. He says, umevorchen alav al mikra Megillah v'shehechiyanu. The Levush is of the opinion that you make two brachas. You make al mikra Megillah, and you make a shehechiyanu on each one of these Megillot, Daha mizman lizman ka'ate, because this is a perennial mitzvah that is only done very rarely, and therefore it warrants shehechiyanu. The only lane these Megillahs once a year. And as such, just like we make a shehechiyanu on Megillas Esther, and we make a shehechiyanu on Tekiyah Shofar, and Netilas Lulav, we do the same thing for the reading of any Megillah. And he writes then that quotes his Rebbe, the Ramah, and he quotes that he said in the Shulchan Aruch that the minhag is not to make a bracha. Ve'eni yodeya lama lo yivarchu alav. And I have no idea why we shouldn't make a bracha on these Megillot. He's assuming it as a given that you should make a bracha, and I can't understand why my Rebbe said not to. And first of all, who has the burden of proof here? Remember, it's a minhag, right? So why does the Levush surprised that the Ramah says not to? So we're going to get to that shortly. Va'od temihani alav. Eich yadas ze haminhag kol kach b'peshitus. My next question is, how does the Ramah know that this is the minhag? Shaharei akol korin balachash u'mevorchin balachash. He says, where I live, and presumably that's where the Ramah lived also, in Poland, people read the Megillah to themselves. How can you tell whether they're saying a bracha on it or not? Umi higidlo shelo barchu kulam im shama sheksas mehem lo barchu. And who told the Ramah that the ganze Welt does not make a bracha? Just because he may have seen a couple of people not making a bracha, how does he know from there that no one else does it? Shema michisaron yedia asu shelo karu. And maybe it's just because of ignorance that people didn't make a bracha. And then he quotes from the Hagahos from the Maharat Turna, from a Rishon, Va'osam shikaru bo baruchu. You see that he brings down that they do make a bracha. Sharei kasav sham beferishim avarchim al elu beis megillas. Va'omrim achar of kaddish yasom kamo she'omrim achar kol. Follow up the reading of the Megillah with kaddish yasom, just like you do after learning. It's a question as to whether you would say kaddish d'Rabbanan or kaddish yasom. The minhag is to say Kaddish Yasom and not to add the additional words of Al Yisrael Val Rabbanan, perhaps because you're reading from Tanakh and you're not reading from words of Chazal. Okay, and maybe Al Talmidehon, Al Yisrael Val Rabbanan Val Talmidehon is only warranted when you're learning Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, it becomes very curious if we look at the Taz. The Taz on the Shulchan Aruch says, the Ha'am, he quotes the Levush, and he says that the Levush is surprised why we shouldn't make a bracha. And I'm going to skip a little bit. He says, he then quotes from the Tshuvas HaRamah, who the Ramah wrote a sefer of Tshuvas after he wrote his gloss on the Shulchan Aruch. And it's in that gloss that the Ramah explains why he feels you should not make a bracha. So we're going to see that in just a moment. So I'm going to skip that part in the Taz because I want to just go show you the Tshuvas HaRamah inside. And finally, based on everything that the Ramah writes, the very last line of the Taz is Al Kain Kol HaMevarech Al Megilot Elohi Bracha Levatola. Them fighting words. Okay, therefore, anyone who makes a bracha on the reading of these Megillas, a bracha levatola. Okay, Let me just scroll down so you can all see this on the screen, those of you who are here. Okay. Bracha levatol. Okay, so that's the Taz over here. All right. Magen Avram disagrees with the Ramah, disagrees with the Taz. He quotes the Ramah and he cites the Ramah's tshuva, and then he writes, Apol halavush ubach uminhagim umate Moshe kasu levarech al kulam chutz mikoheles v'chein ikar keminhag kadmonein. And all of these Sfarim say that you should make a bracha, except for Koheles. Now, why should Koheles be any different? Can anyone think why Koheles you wouldn't make a bracha? Right, there's a Gemara in Megillah that debates, that cites that the Chachamim were debating whether Koheles is Mitame Yadayim. What? Yes, right. But there the Mishnah in Yadayim is emphatic that Shir Hashirim is Kodshe Kodshim, right? But in Koheles, it's a little bit more equivocal. And that's why some hold that you don't make a bracha dafka on Koheles. But let's take a look at the Bir Hagra. The Gra says V'nohagin shemedaber b'gu'ulas Mitzrayim. So first of all, why do you read Shir Hashirim on Pesach? Because the whole song, even though it's not apparent from the words, is really a metaphor for the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, now as far as making the bracha, let's skip. Okay, third line. Ve'amrinan b'masechet sofrim, hakorei b'chamesh megillos mevarech al mikra Megillah, va'afilu hiksuva bein haksuvim. So he quotes Masechet Sofrim, says to make a bracha on each Megillah, even if it's part of a larger ksuvim scroll. V'chein kos of maharil levarech, kenal afim eina ksuva begilion, even if it's not written on a cloth, on a scroll, even if it's just in a chumash, the maharil says you should make a bracha. V'chein kos of bahagos maimoni hilchos tisha b'av b'chein minhag delo kemordechai. Shekasa b'perak kama de Megillah levarech al mikra ksuvim ad kan lashon darkei Moshe. So he quotes the darkei Moshe as saying you do make a bracha. V'chein kasav bach levush minhagum matei Moshe levarech af she'ein ksuvim begilion. V'kol shekein kshem ksuvim begilion k'sefer Torah v'chein minhag kol harishonim v'chein kasav Magen Avram. He quotes a whole litany, including the Magen Avram, that certainly, first of all, you make a bracha on every Megillah. But certainly you make a bracha on the Megillah if it's written begilion, if it's written on a cloth, right? So that would certainly. Okay. So comes along the Gra, and he concludes by saying Umasha kosav chutz mikoheles lesa. He says that suggestion that the Magen Avram makes that you wouldn't make a bracha on Koheles, that's not true. The besof per gimel diadayim maskanas masnifsin sham dechein nechluku bechein gamru here hashirim v'koheles shavim l'tamei yadayim. That there's no difference between Shir Hashirim and Koheles. They both make the hands tamei, and therefore it is a legitimate Megillah. You would definitely make a bracha, and that's the psak of the Rambam. Shekol hey Megillos mitamis hayadayim k'sefer Torah v'chein kasav. What is this? I don't remember what this abbreviation is. Perakama de Megillah shekulan shavim lebracha zu v'chein ikar. So the Gra paskins categorically that you definitely make a bracha on the reading of the Megillah, and that's his maskana. The Mishnah Brura, based on this machlokes, says that because the Gra was so emphatic, certainly if you make a bracha, if it's written on cloth, vaday lo hits. It's definitely not doing anything wrong. He doesn't say that, he doesn't advocate for it, the Mishnah Brura, but at the same time, he doesn't say you shouldn't do it. He says there's nothing wrong with doing it and absolutely nothing wrong with making a bracha. Later on, I'll explain to you why I feel it's so important to make a bracha. I'll get there in a moment. Let's take a look at the Shut Ramah very briefly. Asher Sha'alta Yedidi al mashe kosafti b'shulchan aruch simin taf peiches be'inyan halel shemevorchem likro hahalel uv'mim gam kosav shenaguam levarech ligmor halel. So he incorporates two questions. What is the nusach of the bracha that you make before you recite Hallel? Is it likro es hahalel, or is it ligmor hahalel? The second question he asks, he says, Od kasafti simin taf tzadi shenagim likro shir hashirim bepesach v'rus b'shavuos b'koheles b'sukos v'ha'am nagu shelo levarich lo al mikra Megillah v'lo al mikra ksuvim uv'maharil kasav levarich al mikra Megillah. So why am I contradicting the Maharil? That's essentially his question. Why did I write in the Shulchan Aruch not to make bracha on these Megillas when the Maharil, who was the great establisher of Minhag Ashkenaz, says that you should make a bracha? Now, we still haven't clarified why a bracha is warranted if it's just a minhag. So we're putting that aside for now. But at least we see that this is a huge debate. So the Ramah himself, Omer ani ashiv al ha'acharon rishon. I'm going to tell you that three reasons why I feel that despite the fact that the earlier Rishonim and Sifrei Halacha do advocate saying a bracha on these Megillas, I concluded that you should not. Well, that's the part of the question that we're going to get to. We're not there yet. Sometimes we saw the language of minhag mevatel halacha in Maseches Sofrim. Sometimes a minhag can be even stronger than halacha. I can't think of any examples right now, but what we're going to see is that sometimes it is warranted to say a bracha on a minhag, even though that doesn't seem that way from the Gemara. But we're not there yet. First, let's finish the arguments of the Ramah, and then we'll get into the general issue. First of all, he says, I have three reasons. Aleph, he says, and we're just going to read the underlined portions of the Tshuvas Ramah. Shebeminhagim shel Moharar Isaac Turna, shanu nohagim basrayu, lo kasav klal levarach al shir hashirim v'rus v'koheles. The Sefer HaMinhagim, which was written by Reb Isaac Turna, early Ashkenazi posek, said that never brings down this idea of making a bracha. It's only brought down by the Levush that in the Haggahos, in the footnotes of Rav Isaac Turna, he says to make a bracha. But in the text itself, there is no mention of making a bracha. Uviyadua ki ilu hayadaito linhog levarech hayakosva k'moshikasav legabe echa levarech. Had he felt that you should make a bracha, he would have stated so, because when it comes to Megillas Eicha, Rabbi Isaac Turna says that you should make a bracha on Eicha. Apparently, there's more of a compelling reason to make a bracha on Eicha than there is on Rus and Shir Hashirim and Koheles. So the fact that he does not make that statement, that's my first clue. Hatam Hashem, second reason, is that there's this whole confusion as to whether you make the bracha of Al Mikra Megillah or Al Mikra Ksuvim. And the Ramah writes in his second reason, which I don't think is such a strong argument, he says, Ume'achar di'ika chiluf begirso snira. He says it's not clear what the correct girsa is, as to whether you always make Al Mikra Ksuvim or only when it's written as part of a cloth. Dim ksuvim bein haksuvim kemo bizman hazeh de'ein megillos elu ksuvim v'megillos kemo bi'amehem. He says nowadays, he's writing in the 16th century, he says nowadays, any scrolls that we have that have these megillas are written as part of ksuvim, and it's not clear whether they warrant a separate bracha of Al Mikra Megillah or Al Mikra Ksuvim. Lahotzi nafsham miplugta nira de'ein levarach alayhu klal. Because if you're making the wrong bracha and we're mesupak, which is the correct bracha, whether it's Al Mikra Megillah or Al Mikra Ksuvim, so you're better off not making a bracha at all. Because whenever you have a suffix whether to make a bracha, you generally don't make a bracha at all. So that argument only holds if your Megillas are written as part of a larger scroll of Ksuvim. Reason number three. Atama Shlishi. Ki yesh li tmoa al bracha zulama. He says, why should you make a bracha? V'chi krios elu chiyuva levarich alayu asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. That should be the main question, Rabbi Isa. That should be the main question. Since when can we say asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu, that God commanded us? He says, "Vehechen matzinu shetzivu chachamim al kach." It's one thing when the chachamim make a takan. We can still say vitzivanu, that God commanded us, because where did God command us to light Hanukkah candles? Lo sasur. Right? There's a commandment in the Torah that you must obey the words of the sages. So if the sages command us to do something, that's tantamount to Hashem telling us to do it, and therefore we have a right to say vitzivanu. But where is there ever a takanas chachamim that is sourced in Torah Sheba'al Peh that tells us that we should make a bracha on the reading of these Megillahs? So that argument is, even a person who's patur from a mitzvah is still allowed to say vitzivanu, because even though I'm not obligated, I have a mitzvah kiyumis. I still fulfill a mitzvah. This mitzvah was given to a segment of Am Yisrael, and I was given the option of participating in that mitzvah. So that's discussed already by the Rishonim, the Rabbeinu Yonan, Maseches Brachos, talks about why women can say Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. Sephardim don't. Sephardi women, I think you're right, don't. But that the majority of the Rishonim find no problem with it. But the bottom line is that he says, I don't understand. Velo, he says, Shari lo nizkru kriyos elu b'talmud, velo b'shum posek meforsam, which is a little bit of a guzma, because as we've seen, so many of the sources of the earlier Sfarim, like the Maharil, and like some of the Rishonim, do say to make a bracha. And then skip down to the next underlined area. Mikol Makom, he says, he then asks a question about the fact that we say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh with a bracha. He says, Mikol Makom nearly delo dami lahasam, the shiny Hallel shehu minhag kavua b'chol Yisrael kemuzkar b'talmud, v'she'ein kein b'minhag zeh. He says, I feel that Hallel is different. Hallel is different because Gans Klal Yisrael, or at least the Ashkenazi world, recites Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. I think all of Klal Yisrael recite Hallel on Rosh Chodesh, and therefore that has become sort of like a minhag kavua, whereas reading the Megillah is not a minhag kavua, and therefore it doesn't warrant saying Vitzivan. And then he says, the Ilomi Stafina, this is still part of reason number 3. If it weren't, I'm hesitant to do so, but I would say, Ki divrei maseches sofrim lo kivnu al krios elu klal. He says, Shema shekosav levarech al kisvei hakodesh hainu biyamehem shayu nogim lahafter bekisvei hakodesh b'mincha b'shabbos. He says, perhaps the only time Maseches Sofrim it says to make a bracha is because they used to do this on Shabbos. They would read Megillahs like they would read Haftorahs. And therefore, Bilachein Bizman Hazeh, Sheinoagin Kain Rak Be'echa Uva Megillah, Ein Levarach Al Hacherim, Kimasha Kol Yachid Kore Megillos Elu, Eino Ela, Kriya B'divrei Megillos Elu, Kikore B'Torah Ba'alma. And he says, since our minhag today, the only 2 Megillas that we read publicly in the Tzibor are Megillas Esther and Megillas Eicha. Those are the only 2 that should get a bracha, but not the 3 Megillas of Shir Hashirim, Ruas, and Koheles. And then finally, he gives the 4th reason, which he says, the Ikerhu Be'ena. The 4th reason, which is the main reason, I feel, he says, Da'af im nomar, V'yesh levarech alayu v'shilazen yiskabnu maseches sofrim, Ainu dafka kishem ksuvim ketiknam b'klafim uv'megilos. Kemo shahaya derech hasfarim harishonim ksuvim b'galila k'sefer Torah. He says, even if you're going to say that what Maseches Sofrim is advocating is to make a bracha on the Megillah the way that we read it today, he says, but that's only in their time when they would write these things on a cloth. Mikol Makom, he says, Yesh lahochiach she'en levarach al Megillos elu, dim haya roy levarach alayu haya lahadir achar Megillos aksuvim ketiknam kibo Megillos Esther. And he says, if anything, I can bring you proof that you don't make a bracha based on the fact that we are not encouraged to write these Megillas on cloth. If there was such an inyan that you make a bracha on a Megillah when it's written on cloth, then why aren't we encouraged to procure these Megillas written on cloth? He says the fact that that is not something that exists within our communities indicates to me that it doesn't get a bracha, regardless of whether it's written on cloth or not. Because if it were to be written on cloth and it would warrant a bracha, then that would be a reason to for every kehillah to do their best to procure a Megillah on cloth. Now, I find that last argument to be a little bit weak because it's very easy to hear why in the 16th century, when it was hard enough for a shul to have its own Sefer Torah, why they wouldn't require communities to have Megillah scrolls or Haftorah scrolls for that matter. Simply because it was a huge expense and people were dying in the streets from poverty and malnourishment. And so these things were a luxury. But in a luxurious society, like the perhaps a couple of centuries later when people could afford these scrolls, then adarabba, we should be samech on the gra and we should make a bracha on it. So before we go any further, this is the upshot. The upshot is that I go like the Mishnah. It says that if they're written on cloth, vadai hamivarech lo hitzid. That's the language of the Mishnah. It's not here in your handout, but that's the language of the. You can look it up. It's in Siman Taf Tzadi. Vadai hamivarech lo hitzid. And so I go like the Levush, who says to say both brachas of Al Mikra Megillah and the bracha of Shehechianu because it's a perennial once-a-year mitzvah. Why do I think it's so important to make a bracha on it? Because now that our communities can afford the atara for the Sefer Torah, we can afford the mantle, we can afford the all types of dedications for a shul, our communities should be encouraged to have kosher klafim and also to train our Bali Kriya to read from these klafim. Because I believe that because we live in a more affluent society and world, this should be a practice that is encouraged. And the way to encourage it is to give it the chashivus of making a bracha. So halavai, that people should go home and share notes and say, oh, I davened in the shtibel today. Oh, did they read Shir Hashirim? No, everyone read it to himself in the shtibel. But we had a Bal Kriya read it from a klaf and he made a bracha and a bracha of Shechianu afterwards. It felt like it was such a hush of a thing. And this will get people to be encouraged to proliferate this practice more and more, and it becomes more special. It's a hit or mitzvah, in my opinion. And that's why I feel that it's important, even though normally my fallback position on so many areas of halacha, that whenever there's a machlokas haposkim, whether to make a bracha or not, I always say safek brachas lahakel. This is the one exception where I feel because of issues of public policy, we should encourage it to be read from a cloth. And one of the ways to encourage it is to say it warrants a bracha. Yes, Cyril.
So by we have a Megillah that warrants a bracha or a cloth. But if it's a cloth, why did you put a cloth and no cloth as to whether or not you make a bracha?
Okay, this is a great question. Why should there be a distinction as to whether there's a cloth or not a cloth? Well, we know that for the reading of Megillah Esther, if I'm reading the Megillah from a chumash, do I make a bracha on it? No. There are halachas in Megillah Esther that in order to be able to make a bracha on it, it has to be written from a cloth. So it could very well be that the halachos of Kriyas HaMegillah for Shir Hashirim, Rus, and Koheles are patterned after the reading of Megillah Esther. Well, that leads to a very interesting shaila in halacha. Why is it that we read the Megillah of Shir Hashirim on Shabbos Chol HaMoed? Do we ever read Megillah Esther on Shabbos? No. If Purim falls out on Shabbos, like it does in Yerushalayim, what is the halacha? Chazal explicitly say you're not allowed to read the Megillah on Shabbos. Why? Shema Yavirenu Dalet Amos. You may be tempted to carry it because you're going to ask someone to show you how to read it. So why then is it that Davka, we read these Megillahs on Shabbos, and we're not concerned with Shema Yaviren? This is not my question. This is a question from Rav Yosef Warman, his She'eris Yosef series. I didn't copy it, but he says that the only time that we're concerned about Shema Yavirenu is if a person is bahul al ha-mitzvah. He's so concerned to fulfill the mitzvah because he knows it's his obligation. And therefore, he's going to be tempted to carry it outside to make sure that he can do the mitzvah properly by asking someone, show me how to read it. But if it's only a minhag, and certainly b'di'evet, if it's not read from a cloth, it's still kosher, we're not concerned of Shema Yavirenu Daled Amos. So it's almost like counterintuitive. When it's a high-level commandment to read it, like Megillah Esther, Chazal step in and they say, you must not read that on Shabbos because Shema Yavirenu, because you may be so concerned, you may be so uptight and nervous about getting it right that you're going to carry it outside. But if it's only a minhag, even though it gets a bracha, so we're not worried that you're going to carry it daled amos. Okay? All right. That adkan is the first part of the shiur. So if you want to stop now, we can stop now, and we can pick it the rest up next week. Or if you want to go a little bit weiter, we'll go a little bit weiter. It's up to you, because there's a Geschmacka piece from the Brisker Rav who really cleans this whole sugya up and gives us a beautiful, elegant explanation as to when we make a bracha on a minhag and when we don't make a bracha on a minhag. Why don't I just introduce you to the Gemara? What's that? Oh, next Monday night is Yom Ha'atzmaut, so we probably won't have a shiur. All right, let me just introduce you to the ideas. We'll see. Okay. Take a look at the Gemara in Maseches Sukkah, Daf Mem Daled Amud Aleph and Amud Beis. Itmar, Rabbi Yochanan, source number 8. Itmar, Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Chad Omar Arava Yesod Neviim, the Chad Omar Arava Minhag Neviim. What is the source for taking the willow branch on Hoshana Rabbah, like you and I do? Every Hoshana Rabbah, we buy Hoshanas. So what is that called? That practice. So one Manda Omar says it's Yesod Neviim, and the other one says it's Minhag Neviim. What does the word Yesod mean? It's a foundational, or it's established by the Neviim, or founded by the Neviim. The other one says it's a Minhag Neviim. Zokt Rashi, v'nafkamina de lo baya bracha. If it's something that was hinhigu et ha'am, that if it was something that, if you say it's a yesod, Rashi says takanas nevi. It's a takana. It was something that they established and commanded us to do. The Nevi'im told us to do. If it's only a minhag, hinhigu et ha'am, they encouraged people to put this into practice, but did not make it a requirement. Mm-hmm. And Rashi says, v'nafkamina de lo baya bracha. And the nafkamina is that it doesn't require a bracha. Oof! The Vilna Gaon just got blown out of the water. Okay? Anyone who says that you should make a bracha on a minhag just got blown out of the water. It's a favorite Gemara. Do you and I make a bracha on taking the arava, taking the Hoshanas on Hoshana Rabbah? No, we don't make a special bracha. Why not? Okay? Because it's a minhag neviim, it's not a yesod neviim. The Rambam in Hilchos Brachos paskins accordingly, source number 9, kol davar shehu minhag, afal pishe minhag neviim hu, any minhag, even if it's a minhag neviim, like meaning it goes back really way back to the times of the prophets, could go netilas arava bishvi shel chag, like taking the Hoshana on Hoshana Rabbah. Ve'ein tzarich lomer minhag chachamim kagon kriyas halel barashei chadashim ubecholo shel moed shel Pesach. And certainly a later minhag, such as reciting Hallel on Rosh Chodesh and during Chol HaMoed Pesach, ein mevorchin Allah. You do not make a bracha. So it's a shtickle mudna. How is it that we, Ashkenazim, we've bastardized the practice? We don't make a bracha on the Hoshanas, but we do make a bracha on Hallel, on Rosh Chodesh, and also, right, like he says, we also only say half Hallel on Chol Hamoed Pesach, in the last days. V'chein kol davar sheyistapek lecha im ton bracha im lav, osen oso below bracha. And anytime you have a suffix, whether a practice warrants a bracha or not, suffix brachas lahakel, ula olam yizaher adam bibracha sheinatzricha v'yarbe bibrachos atzrichas. And a person should always be careful not to make gratuitous brachas, and only make and try to make as many brachas as he can, as long as they're necessary. V'chein David Omar b'chol yom avoracheka, as David said, every day I will bless you, I will give you a bracha. Sorry, Laser, what do you want to say?
But he does look at the answer is that something. He does actually, without specifying a Rava specifically, does address the concept of brachas or Havel.
He says this. One of his arguments was, it's not clear to me which bracha you would make. Right. Right. It's right. So that's right. Correct. Right. He agrees with the Rambam in principle. But he also, the Ramah certainly paskins that we make a bracha on Chatzi Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. So why is that not a stira to what the Ramah holds? What about the argument of Safek bracha? Okay, so the Ravid disagrees. The Ravid says, "Nirali shelo amru ela al cholom shel Pesach bilvad aval shel Rosh Chodesh bebracha tiknuhu kidei lefarsamu shu Rosh Chodesh." I don't think that the Rambam ever meant to not say a bracha on Hallel Rosh Chodesh, because there's a mitzvah to be mefarsim that it's Rosh Chodesh. You're mefarsim it by making a bracha on Hallel. Va'anu minhagenu levarich bekulan ve'ein lanu lilmod me'arava. He says our minhag is to make a bracha on all these practices, even minhagim, and you can't derive any raya from the hadas, the hoshanas on Hoshana Rabbah, because you're not saying any shevach v'hoda'a when you pick it up. Now that's a very interesting argument. That's very noteworthy. We haven't seen this, this argument yet, but we're going to get there. And therefore, why should it warrant the bracha? All you're doing is picking something up. Aval Priyas hahalol b'yamam hamikudashim v'korban musaf bahem im tiknu bahen hahalol mishum heker likdushasan yafa asu v'tzarich bracha ad kan l'shon. The Ravid says, and that's why halal is different. The rabbis told us to say halal on those days, even though they only said it b'toras minhag, but they did it in order to distinguish that this is a holy time that has a korban musaf. They wanted to demonstrate its holiness, and therefore it's appropriate to make a bracha. Okay. Now, on this Gemara in Maseches Sukkah about not making a bracha on the Hoshana, on Hoshana Rabbah, we're just going to look at the underlined portions of the Tosfos here. He first quotes Rashi, who said that if it's only a minhag neviim, then it wouldn't need a bracha. Okay, because you can't say vitzivanu. Vitzivanu implies that the rabbis commanded us to do it. But if it's only a minhag, then there's vafilu bichlal lo sasur lese. Then there's not even a prohibition of lo tasur, like you were saying before, Laser. That with every rabbinic commandment, it's a biblical commandment of lo tasur. You can't even say that if it's only a minhag. Now, skip to the next underlined portion. He says, v'yesh medaktikin mitoch kach we have a Gemara in Maseches Tainis that clearly indicates that saying half Hallel on Rosh Chodesh is just a minhag. And therefore, it would follow from this Gemara about the Hoshana that you would not say a bracha on Rosh Chodesh either. Because the Gemara there quotes the story of Rav Ikla Lebavel, Chazi de Karu Hallel B'Rosh Chodesh. Rav comes to Bavel. He sees that they're reciting Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. Savar la'afsu kinhu. And he wanted to stop them and say, Chever, what are you doing? Stop. You're not supposed to say Hallel on Rosh Chodesh. But Shama dekamidalgi ba'azli. But then he noted that they were skipping paragraphs in the Hallel. So Amar Shma Mina Minhag Avosehem Biyadeh. So he said, oh, this is a minhag that they inherited from their ancestors. This is not a halachic issue, only a minhag, and therefore I'll leave them alone. So it seems that based on this, you should not make a bracha on halal as well. And then he quotes Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam oimer de'ein raya me arava lahalel. The arava ena ela tiltul. This is what we saw foreshadowed in the ride. He says the difference between halal and the arava is that the arava, all you're doing is picking up an object. Okay? The kevin delav takantehi ela minhaga lo chashiva lemikvala bracha. And since it was not instituted as a mandatory practice, and it's only a minhag to pick up a hadas, not a hadas, an arava, then it doesn't warrant saying a bracha on such a sort of non sort of a trivial kind of activity, right? That doesn't involve saying any words of praise to Hashem. Reciting Hallel is never worse than reciting psukim from the Torah. Udekavase ashkechan v'mevorchen ashnei yomim tovim shel galios ve'eno ela minhag be'alma. And he says we find that we do make a bracha when on the second day of Yontif, when we say full Hallel. And even though it's only a minhag to have a second day Yontif in Golos, minhag avosenu biyadenu, right? Umihu ein mizeh raya dehataima de'ein mevarchim ha'arav leman da'omer minhag neviim mishum delo efshar lomer v'tzivanu. Ubeis yamim tovim shel golios ein bohem v'tzivanu ela kiddush lahaskaras hayom b'tfila. Birkas hamazon. He says, but on the other hand, you could argue that the reason why we make a bracha on Yom Tov Sheni is because we're making Kiddush on Yom Tov Sheni. And when we're making Kiddush on Yom Tov Sheni, there's nothing wrong because the Kiddush doesn't have the word Vitzivanu. Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosa Vitzivanu, to do a particular mitzvah. Okay? But he says, and in benching, V'imishum devarchin and atakia shofar b'yom tov shein Rosh Hashanah, anu takanta ninu v'chamir b'beis yom tovim shel galios le'inyan beitza kedusha echas ninu. We're not going to go into that now. The way that it seems that the brisk Rav understands it, we won't have time to go into the text tonight, is that he looks at, and he uses classic brisker language he talks about the cheftza of Talmud Torah. This is, you can go through it yourself. It's in the Chidushay Maran Riz Halevi al Harambam. Took me a while to get a hold of a copy because it's not in Otsar Chachma. So I had to actually source this. I had to crowdsource this text. I went on Facebook. There's a Facebook group called Ask the Beit Midrash. And I said, does anyone have a copy of the Riz Rambam? And someone was kind enough to send it to me. So we do have it here? I had no idea. It's in the Turk. Okay, thanks for letting me know. I'll know for next time. And basically, the Brisker Rav's argument goes something like this. On a minhag that is not accompanied by a practice which itself is a mitzvah, you don't make a bracha. But if there's a minhag to do something which, when it's a mitzvah, you make a bracha on it, such as Talmud Torah or Kriyas Hallel, so that's the cheftza of a mitzvah already. In other words, it's the mitzvah itself, and the minhag is not the mitzvah. The minhag is when you do that mitzvah. So that's the chiluk. The whole institution of the taking a Hoshana on Hoshana Rabbah is a newfangled institution that does not have any source at any other time to take a bundle of willow branches and to hold them, stand alone, outside of the Arba Minim. So that is a minhag neviim that is not attached to a well-established mitzvah practice. But if the minhag is to do something that is already an established mitzvah on other days, and to add those mitzvah practices on days where previously Klal Yisrael wasn't doing that mitzvah, that does warrant a bracha. We say Hallel 18 times a year, the Gemara says. There's a mitzvah to recite Hallel on Yom Tov. There's a mitzvah to recite Hallel on Chanukah. So the mitzvah of Hallel is something that is a mitzvah, and the minhag is to take that chefza shel mitzvah and to move it to another day, such as Rosh Chodesh. And therefore, it warrants the recital of a bracha, even though it's only a minhag. That's right. That's where you get a sheksha mitzvah b'tzivanu, because this mitzvah was commanded to me by either Hashem or the Chachamim, but it's only a minhag that I do it today. But the mitzvah itself, in the abstract, is a commanded mitzvah, just not on this particular day. So therefore, that's the argument to allow you to make a bracha on the recital of Al Mikra Megillah. It's the same argument, because we do make a what? The Rambam will disagree. The Rambam will disagree. The Rambam holds. Yes, but he's also defending the practice of saying Hallel with the bracha on Rosh Chodesh. So, I mean, it's true. It's a commentary on the Rambam, but in the course of that commentary, but here it starts with let me just see what the pertinent language is. So first of all, he wants to prove that even when you violate a minhag, according to the Rambam, you're in violation of lo tasur, because the Rambam seems to say that. So therefore, he says, "Va'nira pasha deladasa Rambam hadein mevarchen ala minhag lav mishum taima di ef shalomar behu v'tzivanu." He says, "De be'emes ladasa Rambam din minhagos hu kechol divrei sofrim," right? But rather, the real reason is the ein mevarchen ala minhag hu zeh din be'etzem hachefza shelahem the lav Torah's mitzvahs behu levarich aleihem. He says because the chefza itself is not something that was ever mandated by Chazal to make a bracha on. The rak al mitzvahs mevarchim below al minhagos. The davar zeh mefurish lehedja b'lashon haramba. So he says that's why we make a bracha on Yom Tov Sheni and we say Vitzivanu. Okay. Okay. And as far as explanation of Rosh Chodesh, let me just see where he does that. Okay, I don't recall how he defends the Rambam's position. Could be I didn't copy that part in the thing. Okay. So Tzarachian, as far as why the Rambam goes even further, and he says that even something that is not if it's not a mandated minhag on that day, then you also wouldn't say Vitzivan. Okay. All right. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. That's the justification for saying Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvos of Vitzivanu al Mikra Megillah. It's the rationale for saying a Shehechiyanu. And that's why, and by the way, for Eicha, the only thing we don't do is say a Shehechiyanu. Because you don't want to say a Shehechiyanu on something that's very sad to remember the Churban. Yeah. Oh, because it's a mournful period. Could be, yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons given. I think another reason is because it's your mesupik whether you're going to be able to fulfill the whole mitzvah. This is only Gloi Milsa once you count 49. So, okay. So we'll hold it here for tonight. I hope that you found something